Miss Marple and the Poison in the Eccles Cakes. Hello and welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I'm so glad you've joined us. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and how did your day go? Leave a comment and let's share a moment together. Don't forget to subscribe for new stories daily. Now, let's start tonight's mystery. Chapter 1, Hot Oven, Cold Raffle. The heat of that witless Monday week settled upon St. Mary Mead like a woolen blanket laid over a sleeping cat. By mid-morning, the high street shimmered with a peculiar haze that made the gray stone of the church tower seem to waver and dance. Miss Marple, pausing at her front gate with secateurs in hand, observed that even the roses looked parched, despite her careful ministrations at dawn. "It will be a long summer," she remarked to nobody in particular, though her companion, a rather superior tabby belonging to the vicarage, appeared to agree by retreating beneath the hydrangea bush. The morning air carried the scent of baking bread, that most comforting of village smells, wafting from Paretta's bakery halfway down the high street. Miss Marple set down her secateurs with decision. She had promised to select something suitable for the parish bandstand repair committee tea, and besides, a small seed cake would be most welcome with her elevenses. The brass rail outside Paretta's gleamed with virtuous polish. Inside, the shop was blessedly cool, its thick walls and tiled floor offering refuge from the June heat. The window display showed a magnificent pyramid of Eccles Cakes, their curved tops golden and sugar-dusted, arranged with geometric precision beneath a small card that proclaimed in careful script, "Friday Fresh." Edwin Paretta stood behind the counter, his apron dusted with flour as white as his thinning hair. He was a man of perhaps 55, with the solid build and careful movements of one who has spent his life measuring and mixing, kneading and watching oven temperatures. There was something thoroughly dependable about Edwin Paretta. One felt that if he said a loaf would be ready at 7, it would be ready at 7, and not a minute sooner or later. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice as warm as his oven's. "You've come at just the right time. The seed cake is barely an hour out of the tin." "How very fortunate," Miss Marple replied, taking in the shop with the quiet observation that was her particular gift. The brass scales gleamed. The marble counter showed not a crumb. Behind Edwin, through the open door to the bakehouse, she could see cooling racks laden with the last batch of the morning's work. "I understand today is the raffle drawing," Miss Marple continued. "For the bandstand fund." "Indeed it is, Miss Marple. The prize hamper is nearly ready. Eccles cakes and tea for 12, with some of my scones and biscuits thrown in for good measure." Edwin's face showed quiet pride. "We've raised nearly £40. The committee is most pleased. Edwin, the Assam is running low." The voice came from the tea-room alcove, sharp and efficient. Maud Paretta emerged through the curtained doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a woman of determined elegance, her dark hair pinned with precision, her expression that of someone who knew exactly how things ought to be done and was prepared to ensure they were. She softened slightly upon seeing Miss Marple. "Oh, good morning. I didn't realize we had a customer. Edwin does tend to chat when there's baking to watch." "The baking is quite finished, dear," Edwin said mildly. "All cooling now, as you can see." Maud's lips tightened fractionally, but she smiled. "Of course. Now, Miss Marple, what may we get for you?" "Perhaps some of our special Eccles cakes. They're particularly fine today." Before Miss Marple could reply, the shop bell jangled with considerable force, and Councillor Harold Vane filled the doorway. He was a large man, both in physical presence and in the space he seemed to demand in any room. His face was red, his collar tight, and his manner suggested someone accustomed to being listened to. "Ah, Paretta. 2 of your Eccles cakes, if you please. Need to check the quality before we hand out that raffle prize, eh? Can't have the parish giving away inferior goods." Miss Marple noticed the faintest flicker across Maud Paretta's face, something that might have been irritation, or perhaps calculation. It vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. "Certainly, counselor," Maud said smoothly. "Would you care to take your tea in the alcove? It's much cooler there." "Capital idea, Mrs. Peretta. I'll have them hot, mind you. Can't abide a cold Eccles cake." Maud moved to the pyramid display with practiced efficiency. Her hands hovered over the top row. She selected 2 cakes, then paused, seeming to reconsider. With a small, decisive movement, she lifted several cakes from the top of the pyramid, placed them carefully in a paper bag, then appeared to change her mind and returned them to their position, rearranging the display with deft fingers. "Barl!" she called toward the back. A young woman emerged from the bakehouse, pretty in a flushed, hurried way, with quick fingers and an anxious eagerness to please. Barl Tansey had worked at Peretta's for nearly 3 years, and it was generally known in the village that she harbored dreams of her own establishment someday. "Barl's tea and cakes," she confided to more than one person, though never, Miss Marple suspected, within Maud Peretta's hearing. Right away, "Mrs. Peretta," Barl hurried past with a teapot, nearly colliding with the doorframe in her haste. Miss Marple watched as Maud placed 2 Eccles cakes on a small plate, their tops gleaming faintly in the light from the window. Something about that gleam caught her attention, though she could not immediately say why. Behind the counter, the morning's baking equipment stood ready for washing. The large earthenware bowl that usually held egg wash for glazing sat beside the mixer, quite dry. The brush that lay across it was stiff, its bristles showing the faint yellow tinge of yesterday's use. "Now then, Miss Marple," Edwin said. "You mentioned a seed cake." "Yes, thank you." "A small one will do nicely," Miss Marple smiled. "And perhaps I might take 2 of those lovely Eccles cakes as well. For later, you understand." Maud had already disappeared into the tea room with Counselor Vane's order. Edwin wrapped the seed cake with care, then reached toward the pyramid. "Allow me," Miss Marple said gently, moving close to the display. "I should like to choose them myself, if you don't mind." "One does so enjoy selecting one's pastries," Edwin chuckled. "Of course, Miss Marple, though I assure you they're all equally good." As Miss Marple leaned over the display, the scent of currants and sugar filled her nostrils. But beneath it something else, something faintly sharp. Not quite right. A scent that reminded her oddly of the furniture polish her maid used on the dining room sideboard. She selected 2 cakes from the middle of the pyramid, and watched as Edwin wrapped them in a paper bag. On the wrapping bench, she noticed a faint mark, circular and dull brown, shadowing the white paper where an earlier bag had rested. From the tea room came the sound of Counselor Vane's voice, loud and satisfied, discussing parish business with the authority of a man who expected to be heeded. Miss Marple paid for her purchases and stepped back into the shimmering heat of the high street, her paper bag rustling gently in her hand. She paused for a moment, looking back at the shop window with its pyramid of golden cakes, and the faintest furrow appeared between her brows. Something, she thought, was not quite as it should be at Peretta's bakery. Something small, perhaps, but then murder was so often accomplished by small things. A little too much of this, a little too little of that. The wrong ingredient in the wrong hands. But she was getting ahead of herself. There was no murder, only a warm June morning and the perfectly ordinary business of a village bakery. At least, not yet. Chapter 2. A Bite and a Collapse. Miss Marple had barely reached the corner by the post office when she heard the commotion. It began as a single cry, high and sharp, followed by the clatter of breaking crockery, and then a confusion of voices rising in alarm. She turned back at once, her paper bag still clutched in one hand, moving with a speed that would have surprised those who thought of her merely as a gentle elderly lady who tended roses and knitted by the fire. A small crowd had already begun to gather outside Peretta's. Mrs. Bantry, who had been examining hats in the milliner's window across the way, came hurrying over with considerably less concern for dignity than usual. "Jane! Whatever has happened? I heard the most dreadful scream. I rather think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that we're about to discover something most unpleasant." They entered the shop together. The scene that met them was one of frozen confusion, as if a photograph had been taken of people in mid-movement. Barl Tansey stood by the curtained doorway to the tea room, one hand pressed to her mouth, her face chalk white. Edwin Peretta had emerged from the bakehouse and stood immobilized, a cooling rack still gripped in his floury hands. Through the open doorway to the tea room, they could see Maud Peretta bending over the alcove table where Counselor Vane had taken his seat mere minutes before. Edwin, fetch Dr. Haydock at once." Maud's voice was sharp with command, though Miss Marple detected something else beneath it. Fear, perhaps, or shock. Edwin set down the rack with a clatter and rushed past them into the street, calling for the doctor. Miss Marple moved forward with deliberate calm, Mrs. Bantry close behind. Counselor Vane sat slumped in his chair, his large frame tilted awkwardly to one side against the wall. His face had taken on a most unnatural color, somewhere between gray and purple. On the table before him lay the remains of his Eccles cake, broken open to reveal the dark currants nestled in their buttery pastry. Sugared crumbs scattered across the white tablecloth. The teacup sat upright, still half full, the Assam cooling slowly in the close air of the alcove. "He just collapsed," Maud said, her voice strained. She was attempting to loosen Vane's collar, her fingers fumbling at the stiff fabric. One moment he was eating quite normally, and the next he gave a small cough and simply folded over. "I thought at first he was choking, but there was no struggle, no gasping for air, just that one cough, and then nothing." Mrs. Bantry, to her credit, did not indulge in hysterics. She moved to feel for a pulse at Vane's wrist, her expression grave. "Is he breathing?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "I cannot tell. His skin is quite cold to the touch." The sound of rapid footsteps announced Dr. Haydock's arrival. He was a man of 60, lean and practical, who had seen most things in his years of country practice and was not easily disturbed. He pushed past the small group that had gathered in the doorway and bent over the counselor with professional efficiency. The examination was brief. When Dr. Haydock straightened, his face told the story before his words did. "I'm afraid he's gone. Can't have been more than a few minutes, but there's nothing to be done now." A collective gasp went through the assembled watchers. Barl began to sob quietly. Maud sank into the chair opposite the dead man, her face rigid with shock. Edwin, who had followed the doctor back inside, stared at his cooling racks as though they had suddenly become objects from another world entirely. "Good heavens," Mrs. Bantry murmured. "In the tea room. Harold Vane dead. How perfectly dreadful." Inspector Slack arrived within the quarter hour, summoned by someone's quick thinking. He was a man who believed firmly in the value of first impressions and the importance of establishing authority from the outset. He surveyed the scene with an expression of grim satisfaction, as though unpleasant events were exactly what he had expected all along. "Right. Then nobody leaves until I've had a word with each of you." He pulled out his notebook with a flourish. "Dr. Haydock, what's your professional opinion? Heart, I suppose. Man his size in this heat, eating a rich pastry. Recipe for trouble, if you ask me." Dr. Haydock frowned slightly. "Possibly. The sudden nature of it is somewhat unusual, but yes, cardiac arrest would be the most obvious explanation. He was not a young man, and he did carry considerable weight." "There you are, then." Inspector Slack looked around with the air of a man who had solved a complex puzzle in record time. Indigestion and heat. Tragic, of course, but these things happen. Still, procedure must be followed. "Mrs. Peretta, You were present. When he collapsed? Maud nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the table. I had just brought his tea. He was breaking open the Eccles cake when I left him. I heard him call out very faintly, and when I came back through the curtain, he was as you see him now. And these cakes, they were prepared here this morning? Nothing unusual about them? Edwin spoke for the first time, his voice hollow. I bake them at dawn, same as always. Same recipe I've used for 20 years. There's nothing wrong with my Eccles cakes, Inspector. Nobody's suggesting there is, Mr. Peretta. Just establishing facts. The man ate rich food on a hot day and his heart gave out. Unfortunate, but clear enough. Miss Marple, who had been standing quietly to one side, her paper bag still in hand, spoke with gentle diffidence. I wonder, Inspector, if I might ask whether Counselor Vane had a history of heart trouble. Inspector Slack turned to her with barely concealed impatience. Miss Marple, I might have known you'd appear at the scene of any unpleasantness. No need for amateur detecting here, thank you very much. This is a simple case of natural causes. Natural causes, Miss Marple repeated softly. Yes, I see. Only, it does seem rather sudden, does it not? No struggle, no cry for help, just that single cough Mrs. Peretta mentioned. Heart attacks are sudden, madam. That's rather the nature of them. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. Actually, Inspector, Miss Marple raises a fair point. The presentation is somewhat atypical. In my experience, cardiac events of this severity generally involve more distress. Clutching at the chest, difficulty breathing, that sort of thing. Vane appears to have simply lost consciousness after that single cough. What are you suggesting, Doctor? I'm not suggesting anything definite, merely observing that an autopsy might be advisable, given the unexpected nature of the death. Inspector Slack's face reddened. An autopsy for a man who ate too much and died in a heat wave? The paperwork alone would be monstrous. Nevertheless, Dr. Haydock said firmly, I believe it would be prudent. Miss Marple moved slightly closer to the table, her eyes on the broken Eccles cake. May I ask, Inspector, whether anyone else has consumed one of this morning's batch? What? Oh, several people, I imagine. Mr. Peretta, how many of these cakes have you sold today? Edwin thought for a moment. Perhaps 15 or 20. The Friday batch is always popular. Nobody else has complained of feeling ill. There you are, Inspector Slack said triumphantly. If there was something wrong with the food, we'd have bodies dropping all over the village. Unless, Miss Marple said very quietly, the problem was not with all the cakes, but with one particular cake. The silence that followed this observation was profound. Inspector Slack stared at her as though she had begun speaking in tongues. Maud Peretta's face went even paler, if such a thing were possible. Barl, sobbing, stopped abruptly. Are you suggesting, Inspector Slack said slowly, that someone deliberately tampered with Counselor Vane's food? That this was not a natural death, but murder? I am suggesting nothing of the kind, Inspector. Merely pointing out that if Dr. Haydock finds the circumstances unusual, perhaps unusual circumstances deserve unusual attention. Mrs. Bantry, who knew her friend well, looked at Miss Marple with sharp interest. Jane, have you noticed something? Perhaps, or perhaps, I'm simply an old woman with too much imagination and too little to occupy her time, as Inspector Slack so often reminds me. Miss Marple smiled gently. Still, I think I should like to purchase 2 more of these Eccles cakes, Mr. Peretta, if I may. For comparison purposes, you understand. Comparison with what? Inspector Slack demanded. With the ones I bought just before poor Counselor Vane's unfortunate collapse, Miss Marple said. They are here in my bag, quite untouched. I had thought to have them with my tea this afternoon, but now I find I'm not particularly hungry." She looked down at the paper bag in her hand, and then at the broken cake on the table before the dead man. Her expression was thoughtful, troubled, and utterly determined. "I think," she said quietly, "that someone should look very carefully at what made those cakes shine." Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices a Shiny Top. The remainder of that Friday passed in a state of hushed agitation that would have been remarkable in a larger town, but was quite unprecedented in St. Mary Mead. By tea time, the entire village knew that Counselor Vane had died in Paretta's tea room. Speculation ran from simple heart failure to exotic theories involving tropical diseases, contracted during his brief posting in India 30 years prior. Miss Marple spent the afternoon in her sitting room with the curtains drawn against the oppressive heat, her knitting needles clicking steadily while her mind worked through quite different patterns. The 2 paper bags from Paretta's sat on the table beside her chair, unopened and carefully labeled in her neat hand. First purchase, 10:45 a.m., and second purchase, 11:30 a.m. Mrs. Bantry called at 4, fanning herself with a hat. "Jane, you cannot simply sit here knitting when there's been a death. The whole village is in an uproar. Inspector Slack has questioned half the high street, and Dr. Haydock has insisted on an autopsy despite the most tremendous fuss from the police. They've taken the body to the mortuary at Market Basing." "How very wise of Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said mildly. "He is a sensible man. But do you really think there was something wrong with the food? Edwin Paretta is beside himself. He says his reputation will be ruined, that nobody will buy his bread again." "I think," Miss Marple said, setting down her knitting, "that Edwin Paretta's bread is quite safe. It is not his baking that concerns me, Dolly. It is what happened after the baking was done." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward with interest. "You have noticed something. I knew it when you made that comment about the shine." "What did you mean?" Miss Marple rose and moved to the table where the paper bags waited. "Before I explain, I should like you to look at something. Come here, my dear, and tell me what you see." She opened the first bag with care and removed one of the Eccles Cakes, setting it on a clean plate. The cake was perfectly formed, its curved top showing the typical golden brown color of well-baked pastry, dusted with coarse sugar that caught the light. "It looks perfectly ordinary to me," Mrs. Bantry said. "Rather appetizing, actually." "Indeed. Now look at this one." Miss Marple opened the second bag and placed another cake beside the first. Mrs. Bantry bent closer, adjusting her spectacles. After a moment, she drew in a sharp breath. Oh, I see. This one has a sort of gleam to it, almost oily, as if it had been polished." "Exactly. And do you notice the scent?" Mrs. Bantry sniffed cautiously. "It smells of currants and sugar, as one would expect. But there's something else. Something slightly sharp. Like furniture polish, perhaps." "Jane, you don't think someone actually polished an Eccles cake?" "Not polished in the usual sense, but I believe someone applied something to the surface after baking. Something that had no business being anywhere near food." Miss Marple moved back to her chair and resumed her knitting, though her eyes remained thoughtful. "This morning, when I was in Paretta's, I observed several things. The first was that Maud Paretta seemed most anxious that Counselor Vane should take his tea in the alcove. The second was the way she handled the pyramid display, lifting cakes from the top and then replacing them before selecting the ones she gave to Vane. But why would she do that? Perhaps to ensure he received a particular cake, or perhaps she was reconsidering which cakes to give him. I cannot be certain yet. Good heavens! You think Maud Paretta deliberately gave him a poisoned cake? I think nothing of the sort at this stage, Miss Marple said firmly. I am merely observing facts. The third thing I noticed was the egg wash bowl and brush behind the counter. They were quite dry and showed yesterday's use, not this morning's. Yet several of the cakes in the window had this peculiar shine. Mrs. Bantry sat down heavily. So if Edwin didn't glaze them this morning, someone else must have done it later, after they were baked and cooling. Precisely. And whatever was used was not egg wash. That gives a lovely golden color, certainly, but not this particular oily gleam. This looks like something else entirely. But what? And more importantly, was it something harmful? That, Miss Marple said, is what we must discover. There was something else I noticed, though I did not fully register its significance at the time. On the wrapping bench there was a brown ring mark on the paper, circular and quite distinct, as if a small bottle had been set down and left a stain. A bottle of what? I cannot say, but I intend to make some discreet inquiries. Miss Marple glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. Mr. Pratt keeps his chemist shop open until 6 on Fridays. I believe I shall take a small walk before supper. Jane Marple, you are going to investigate. Inspector Slack will be furious. Inspector Slack, Miss Marple observed, is convinced that poor Councillor Vane died of natural causes brought on by heat and indigestion. He may well be correct. But if he is not, then someone in St. Mary Mead has committed murder using what should have been a perfectly innocent Friday morning treat, and that person must be found before they cause further harm. She wrapped the shiny Eccles cake carefully in a clean handkerchief and placed it in her handbag. I shall take this with me. Mr. Pratt is knowledgeable about many things, including substances that might leave an oily residue. But Jane, if that cake is poisoned, you shouldn't be carrying it about. My dear Dolly, I have no intention of eating it. I merely wish to show it to someone who might identify what has been applied to the surface. Knowledge, after all, is our best defense against wickedness. The walk to Pratt's chemist and ironmongery took less than 10 minutes. The shop was blessedly cool, its thick stone walls and high ceiling creating a refuge from the afternoon heat. Mr. Pratt himself stood behind the counter, a spare man with rimless spectacles, and the precise manner of someone who measured things for a living. Miss Marple, what a pleasure. I trust you are keeping well in this dreadful heat. As well as can be expected, thank you, Mr. Pratt. I wonder if I might consult your expertise on a small matter. She removed the wrapped cake from her handbag and set it on the counter. I am curious about the coating on this pastry. It has an unusual appearance and scent, and I wondered if you might identify what substance has been applied to it. Mr. Pratt bent over the cake with professional interest. He did not touch it, but examined it closely and sniffed with caution. His expression changed from curiosity to concern. Miss Marple, where did you obtain this? From Paretta's bakery this morning. Why do you ask? Because, unless I'm very much mistaken, this has been treated with some form of household tincture. See how it has a greasy appearance and that particular sharp smell? That is not a food substance, I can assure you. Could such a tincture be dangerous if consumed? Mr. Pratt removed his spectacles and polished them, a sign of agitation. Consumed? Good gracious, yes. Depending on the specific formulation, even a small amount could cause severe distress. Convulsions, difficulty breathing, collapse. Miss Marple, has someone eaten food prepared in this manner? I believe, Miss Marple said quietly, that someone has, and that person died this morning in Paretta's tea room. Mr. Pratt replaced his spectacles with trembling fingers. Dear me, this is most serious. You must inform the police at once. I shall, Mr. Pratt, but first, I wonder if you might consult your ledger. Has anyone from Paretta's purchased such a tincture recently? For household use, perhaps? The chemist hesitated, clearly troubled by the breach of confidence this represented. But murder, as Miss Marple's expression gently reminded him, superseded normal discretion. He fetched his ledger and turned the pages. Yes, here. Yesterday morning, Mrs. Maud Peretta purchased a small bottle of household tincture and some linen bluing. She paid cash. She said it was for the laundry. For the laundry, Miss Marple repeated softly. How very domestic. Tell me, Mr. Pratt, if such a tincture were applied to pastry and then consumed, what marks might it leave? Marks? Well, the bottle would leave a greasy ring on any paper it touched. The brush used to apply it would retain traces, and the person handling it would likely get some on their clothing, particularly if they were careless. It is quite persistent, you see, difficult to wash away completely. Miss Marple thanked him and made her way slowly back through the village. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the high street. Peretta's bakery had closed early, its windows dark behind the brass rail. She thought of Maud Peretta's efficient hands rearranging the pyramid, of the brown ring on the wrapping bench, of the way Maud had ensured Counselor Vane took his seat in the alcove, away from other eyes. Small things, perhaps. But murder, as Miss Marple knew well, was so often accomplished through small things, executed by hands that appeared merely helpful. Chapter 4. 2 pricks. 3 pricks. Saturday morning brought no relief from the heat. The clouds were gathering on the horizon in a way that suggested thunder before nightfall. Miss Marple rose early and attended to her garden before the sun grew too fierce, but her thoughts were not on roses. At 9, she presented herself at the police station in Market Basing, where Inspector Slack maintained his office. The inspector received her with barely concealed resignation. Miss Marple, I suppose you've come about yesterday's business at the bakery? Indeed I have, Inspector. I believe you should examine these. She placed the 2 wrapped cakes on his desk with care. The one on the left is quite ordinary. The one on the right has been treated with a household tincture purchased by Mrs. Peretta from Mr. Pratt's establishment. Inspector Slack's expression shifted from irritation to grudging attention. A household tincture? What sort of tincture? The sort that has no place in a bakehouse, and every potential to cause harm if consumed. Mr. Pratt will confirm both the sale and the nature of the substance. I believe you will find it corresponds to whatever Dr. Haydock discovers in his autopsy. The inspector was silent for a long moment, studying the cakes. You're suggesting this was deliberate poisoning? I am suggesting that you investigate the possibility. Yes, there is also the matter of the pricking pattern. The what? Edwin Peretta is a craftsman, Inspector. He has baked Eccles Cakes in the same manner for 20 years. Each cake is pricked twice on top before baking to allow steam to escape. Always twice, never more, never less. It is his trademark, if you will. His pride. I fail to see what that has to do with anything. Then perhaps, Miss Marple said gently, you should look at the cakes in Peretta's window display. I noticed yesterday that while most showed the expected 2-prick pattern, at least one showed 3 pricks, at a different spacing. That suggested to me that someone other than Edwin had handled the tops after baking. Inspector Slack reached for his hat. Right, we'll go and have a look, shall we? Though I warn you, Miss Marple, if this turns out to be another of your flights of fancy. If I am wrong, Miss Marple said calmly, I shall apologize most sincerely to all concerned and return to my knitting with a humbled spirit. They drove to St. Mary Mead in the police motor car. Arriving to find the bakery shuttered but not locked, Edwin Peretta answered their knock, looking haggard and considerably older than his years. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from sleeplessness or weeping, Miss Marple could not determine. Inspector, Miss Marple, please come in. The shop felt abandoned despite having closed only yesterday. The pyramid of Eccles Cakes still stood in the window, though several had been removed for police examination. The brass scales gleamed unused on the counter. Mr. Peretta, Inspector Slack began, I need to ask you some questions about your baking methods. Edwin nodded wearily. Ask what you will. I have nothing to hide. My baking is honest work, always has been. How do you prick the tops of your Eccles cakes? The baker looked startled by the question. I use a single fork, 2 prongs. Makes 2 neat holes for the steam. Been doing it that way since I learned the trade as a boy. Always 2 holes, never 3, never. 2 is sufficient and proper. 3 would be wasteful of motion and would spoil the symmetry. Miss Marple moved closer to the window display. The morning light fell across the remaining cakes, illuminating their tops with clarity. She counted silently, her eyes moving from one to the next. Inspector, if you would be so kind as to examine this row. Slack joined her, bending to peer at the cakes. His frown deepened. Well, I'll be. These here have 2 marks, as the man says. But this one and that one over there, they've got 3. Plain as day, Edwin came forward, his face expressing bewilderment. That cannot be right. I pricked them all myself before they went into the oven. Could someone have pricked them after baking? Miss Marple asked, but why would anyone do such a thing? It serves no purpose. The steam has already escaped during baking. Perhaps not to let steam out, Miss Marple said, but to let something else in, or rather, to disguise the fact that something had been applied to the surface. An extra prick or 2 might make a treated cake look more textured, less obviously glazed. Slack's expression had taken on the focused quality of a man beginning to see a pattern. Mr. Peretta, where are the cakes you baked yesterday? The ones that weren't sold? Now, those that weren't sold are on the cooling rack in the bakehouse. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away, though I suppose I shall have to. They moved through to the back room, where the last tray of Friday's batch sat undisturbed on its wire rack. Miss Marple examined them carefully. Every cake showed precisely 2 pricks, no more, no less. The pattern was as regular as clockwork. All 2 prick here, she observed, which suggests the 3 prick cakes were altered after they left the cooling rack and were placed in the window. By whom? Edwin's voice was hollow. That is what we must determine. Inspector, I believe you should also examine the waste bin beneath the wrapping bench. Slack knelt and peered into the small bin where paper, scraps and string ends accumulated. Among the debris lay a torn circle of pastry, golden brown and dusted with sugar. He lifted it carefully. 3 pricks, he said quietly. This is a top that was removed and discarded. Removed and replaced, I suspect, Miss Marple said. Someone wished to disguise what they had done to certain cakes. They took a clean top from the dough scraps, pricked it 3 times to create texture, and pressed it over a cake that had been treated with a tincture. Edwin sank onto a stool, his face gray. But who? Who would do such a thing in my bakehouse? Someone who had access to the shop after the baking was done, Miss Marple said. Someone who understood which cakes would be sold to which customers. Someone who was, shall we say, particularly helpful. At that moment, footsteps sounded from the front room. Maud Peretta appeared in the doorway, dressed for shopping with her handbag over her arm. She stopped short at the sight of the inspector and Miss Marple. Edwin, I didn't realize we had visitors. Inspector Slack, I trust you've concluded that poor Counselor Vane's death was simply tragic. Misfortune, Slack said nothing, but his gaze traveled from Maud's composed face to the discarded pastry top in his hand, then to the 3 pricked cakes in the window. Mrs. Peretta, I wonder if you might explain something. Who arranged the window display after your husband finished baking yesterday morning? A flicker crossed Maud's face, too quick to name. Why, I believe Barl did that. Or perhaps I did myself. It's difficult to recall such small details. And who, Miss Marple asked gently, pricked those cakes a 3rd time? The silence that followed was profound. Edwin stared at his wife as though seeing a stranger. Maud's hands tightened on her handbag. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Edwin pricks all the cakes, don't you, Edwin? But Edwin was looking at his wife's hands, at her efficient fingers that managed the cash box and the tea room and every detail of the shop's operation. Hands that, Miss Marple thought, were quite capable of painting a few cake tops with poison while claiming only to make them pretty. "Maud," Edwin whispered. "What have you done?" She lifted her chin. "I have done nothing but try to save this business from ruin. And if you cannot see that, Edwin Peretta, then you are a fool." Inspector Slack reached for his notebook. "Mrs. Peretta, I believe you had better come with me to the station. We have a great deal to discuss." Chapter 5. The Bag with a Ring. Maud Peretta did not accompany Inspector Slack to the station quietly. She protested her innocence with considerable vigor, while maintaining an icy composure that Miss Marple found more revealing than any display of emotion might have been. A guilty conscience often expressed itself through excessive calm, she had observed over the years, as though the perpetrator believed that sufficient self-control might render them invisible to scrutiny. By noon, the village was alive with fresh speculation. The nature of the gossip had shifted dramatically, from sympathetic murmurs about sudden cardiac failure to darker whispers of deliberate wickedness. Miss Marple, returning from the bakery, found Agnes Reed waiting at her gate with the unmistakable air of someone bursting with information. Agnes was the postmistress, a position that granted her access to a remarkable quantity of village intelligence, both official and otherwise. She was a woman of 40-odd years, sensible in most matters, but possessed of that particularly human failing, the inability to keep interesting information entirely to herself. "Miss Marple, I simply had to speak with you. I've been quite distressed since yesterday, wondering whether I ought to have mentioned what I saw. Come inside. Agnes, the sun is rather fierce for standing about in the street." Once settled in the sitting room with tea and biscuits, Agnes leaned forward with an earnestness that suggested genuine concern beneath her evident excitement. "It was yesterday morning, you see, just before opening time. I was arranging the parcels when I looked out and saw Mrs. Peretta taking delivery of something from Mr. Pratt's shop. A young lad brought it over, one of those boys he employs for errands. She took a small package and slipped it into her pocket most quickly, as if she didn't wish to be seen." "What time would this have been?" 8, perhaps 8:45. "The bakery doesn't open until 9, but Mrs. Peretta was already about. She seemed rather furtive, if I may say so." Miss Marple considered this. The timeline was significant. If Maud had collected the tincture that early, she would have had ample opportunity to apply it to selected cakes before the shop opened and customers began arriving. "Did you see anything else unusual that morning?" Agnes hesitated, then nodded. Later, perhaps an hour after opening, Mrs. Peretta came into the post office. She had a letter to send to Market Basing, to a Mrs. Crowther. She paid for postage and seemed quite cheerful about it. She said something about womanly sympathy, that Mrs. Crowther had been unwell, and she was sending good wishes. "Mrs. Crowther," Miss Marple repeated softly. "That would be the wife of Mr. Crowther who runs the competing bakery in Market Basing. The very same." I thought it odd at the time, as I'd never known Mrs. Peretta to be particularly friendly with the Crowthers, rather the opposite, in fact. There's been considerable rivalry between the two establishments. After Agnes departed, Miss Marple sat in thought for some time. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though not yet a complete picture. She was roused from her contemplation by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who appeared both irritated and grudgingly impressed. "Miss Marple, you were quite right about that tincture. Dr. Haydock has confirmed traces of it in Counselor Vane's stomach contents. Enough to kill a man twice his size, he says. It's a wonder the poor fellow lasted even those few minutes. As for Mrs. Peretta, she's confessed not a word. Claims she purchased the tincture for laundry purposes, as she told Mr. Pratt. and says she has no idea how it might have ended up on the cakes. Suggests perhaps Edwin made some mistake, though she's quick enough to add that her husband is normally most careful. How convenient for her to cast suspicion elsewhere while maintaining her own innocence. Tell me, Inspector, have you examined the wrapping bench at the bakery? The wrapping bench? Why would I do that? Because I believe you will find evidence there. When I was in the shop yesterday morning, I noticed a brown ring mark on the paper covering the bench. It appeared to be a stain from a small bottle, roughly the size of the one Mr. Pratt sold to Mrs. Peretta. Slack made a note in his book with evident reluctance. Anything else you've noticed that I ought to know about? Mrs. Peretta's apron might repay examination. If she handled the bottle and then the cakes, there may well be traces on the fabric. And you should inquire about her correspondence with Mrs. Crowther in Market Basing. Agnes Reed mentioned a letter sent yesterday morning, which strikes me as curious, given the supposed rivalry between the two bakeries. The inspector departed with considerably more purpose than he had. Arrived, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, though her needles moved more slowly than usual. There was something still nagging at her, some detail not quite resolved. Mrs. Bantry arrived in the late afternoon, full of news from the village. Jane, the most extraordinary thing. Inspector Slack has been questioning everyone about Maud Peretta's movements yesterday morning. Apparently, young Crowther from Market Basing saw her speaking with a delivery van at 8. The van had Market Basing markings on it, and Maud seemed most engaged in conversation with the driver. How very interesting. And what does Maud say about this? She claimed she was merely asking about delivery times for flour. But the driver works for Crowther's bakery, not for the mill. Why would she be discussing deliveries with her husband's competitor? Why indeed, Miss Marple murmured. Unless she was discussing something else entirely, something more profitable than flour deliveries. You think she was arranging to sell Perettas to Crowther? I think it possible. Edwin strikes me as a man who would never willingly abandon his bakehouse, but Maud is ambitious, and perhaps she saw an opportunity to profit from her husband's good reputation, while escaping what she might view as the drudgery of village commerce. But where does Counselor Vane fit into all this? Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked at her friend steadily. Counselor Vane sat on the parish tenders committee. He would certainly have known if there were plans to sell or transfer a local business license. If he discovered Maud was negotiating behind her husband's back, he might well have threatened to expose her, and she killed him to keep him quiet. I believe that is precisely what happened. She purchased the tincture under the pretense of household use, applied it to selected cakes, and ensured that Counselor Vane received one of the treated ones when he made his customary Friday purchase. She had only to be helpful, as she always was, and guide the right cake into the right hands. Mrs. Bantry shuddered. How perfectly cold-blooded to plan such a thing over tea and Eccles Cakes in one's own shop. Murder is often cold-blooded, my dear. It is the hot-blooded crimes, the ones committed in passion or panic, that are usually discovered quickly. It is the calculated wickedness carried out with ordinary household items in ordinary settings that proves most dangerous, precisely because it appears so domestic, so innocent. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. I believe Inspector Slack will find what he needs when he examines that wrapping bench and Mrs. Peretta's apron. The brown ring will match the bottle, and the stains on her clothing will tell their own story. One cannot handle poison without leaving traces, no matter how careful one tries to be. And then it will all be over. Not quite, Miss Marple said quietly. There is still the matter of how she disguised what she had done. The 3 pricks instead of 2, the caraway seeds where none belonged, small touches meant to make poisoned cakes look ordinary. When we understand those final details, then we shall have the complete picture. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. The long heat was finally breaking. Chapter 6. Alibi by dawn and dinner. The thunderstorm broke shortly after midnight, bringing blessed relief from the week's oppressive heat. By Sunday morning, the air had cleared and St. Mary Mead looked freshly washed, its gardens grateful, and its inhabitants considerably more comfortable. Miss Marple attended the early service at St. Mary's, noting that Edwin Peretta was absent, but that Barl Tansey sat in her usual pew, red-eyed and clutching a handkerchief. After the service, Miss Marple encountered Inspector Slack on the church path. He had the look of a man who had slept little and thought much. "Miss Marple, I suppose you'll want to know. We found the evidence you mentioned. The wrapping bench shows a clear ring mark that matches the bottle bottom precisely. And Mrs. Peretta's apron has stains that correspond to the tincture. She's still denying everything, mind you, but the case is building. What of alibis, Inspector? Have you established who was where during the critical hours?" Slack consulted his notebook with the air of a man reciting a lesson learned. "The bakehouse work begins at 5 on Fridays. Edwin Peretta and young Barl were both present from that time until 9, when the shop opened. Multiple batches of bread and cakes, all requiring constant attention. Neither of them could have left without the other noticing. And Mrs. Peretta? She claimed she was managing the front of the shop, preparing the tea room, setting up the counter. Says she sent Barl out twice to the post office and once to Pratt's for supplies during the morning. How convenient that Barl was sent away at intervals. That would have given Mrs. Peretta several opportunities to work unobserved. My thinking exactly. We've spoken to Agnes Reed, who confirms Barl came into the post office at approximately 8:15 and again at 9:30. The second visit was to purchase stamps for the raffle correspondence." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the visit to Mr. Pratt's? That was earlier, around 7:45. Barl was sent to collect some baking powder that Mrs. Peretta claimed they were running short of. But here's the curious thing. When we checked with Edwin, he says they had plenty of baking powder, no shortage at all. So Mrs. Peretta invented an errand to remove Barl from the premises while she collected her own purchase from Mr. Pratt. Very tidy." The boy who delivered Mrs. Peretta's package from Pratt's confirms he arrived at the bakery at approximately 8:40. Mrs. Peretta met him at the side door, took the package, and paid him with a 6-pence tip for his discretion. For his discretion. Those were her exact words. Near enough. The lad says she told him there was no need to mention the delivery to anyone, as it was just household items and not worth remarking upon, which naturally had the opposite effect of fixing it firmly in his memory. People so often fail to understand that attempting to suppress information only makes it more memorable. They walked together toward the vicarage gate, where Inspector Slack had left his motor car. The morning sun was warm but no longer oppressive, and the gardens along the high street showed renewed vigor after the rain. What of Mr. Crowther? Have you established his movements? He was at his own bakery in Market Basing from 6 until well past 10, multiple witnesses, including his apprentices and several early customers. There's no possibility he could have tampered with the cakes himself, but he could have been complicit in the arrangement to purchase Peretta's. Has the letter to Mrs. Crowther been examined? Slack's expression darkened. We've requested it, but Mrs. Crowther claimed she destroyed it upon reading. Says it was merely a note of sympathy regarding her recent indisposition, nothing more. How unfortunate, though the fact that it existed at all is suggestive, particularly given the timing. There's one more thing, Slack said, lowering his voice, though they were quite alone on the path. We've spoken to several members of the Parish Tenders Committee. It seems Councillor Vane had been making inquiries about business transfers within the village. He'd specifically asked about procedures for transferring bakery licenses and what oversight the committee had over such transactions. When did he make these inquiries? The week before his death. According to the committee chairman, Vane seemed to think there might be some irregularity in a proposed transfer, though he wouldn't specify what he discovered or who was involved. Miss Marple stopped walking and turned to face the inspector directly. Then the motive becomes even clearer. Mrs. Peretta had arranged to sell the bakery without her husband's knowledge, probably for a substantial sum that she intended to keep for herself. Counselor Vane discovered the deception and threatened to expose her to both Edwin and the parish authorities. She could not allow that to happen. The problem, Slack admitted reluctantly, is proving she knew about Vane's investigation. Without that link, we have method and opportunity, but insufficient motive for a jury. Perhaps Edwin can help establish that link. If Vane confronted Mrs. Peretta directly, Edwin might have overheard something, even if he didn't understand its significance at the time. They had reached the motor car. Inspector Slack opened the door but paused before entering. "Miss Marple, I'll admit I didn't take your concerns seriously at first. Thought you were seeing mysteries where none existed. But you've been right about every detail so far." "Not every detail, Inspector. I still don't fully understand the significance of those caraway seeds that Counselor Vane's crumbs revealed." Caraway belongs on Banbury cakes, not Eccles, yet someone placed them deliberately. There's a reason for that, and until we understand it, we haven't completely unraveled Mrs. Peretta's method. Seeds seem a small thing to worry about when we've got poison and premeditation. Small things, Inspector, are often the most revealing. They show us the murderer's mind, the little touches they added, thinking themselves clever, and it is precisely those touches that betray them in the end. After Inspector Slack departed, Miss Marple walked slowly back to her cottage. The morning service had been well attended, the hymns sung with particular fervor, perhaps in reaction to the week's shocking events. The vicar had preached on the nature of sin in ordinary places, choosing his text from Proverbs. "There are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood." Hands that shed innocent blood. Miss Marple thought of Maud Peretta's efficient hands, arranging cakes in a pyramid, painting selected tops with poison, ensuring the right cake reached the right customer, all done with such calm competence, as though she were merely being helpful. But then, murderers so often were helpful people. It was helpfulness that provided cover, that allowed them to guide events without appearing to do so. The helpful person who tidies the medicine cabinet and accidentally switches bottles. The helpful person who offers to serve tea and selects a particular cup for a particular guest. Mrs. Peretta had been very helpful. Indeed, on that fatal Friday morning, the question now was whether 12 jurors could be made to see past the facade of domestic efficiency to the calculated wickedness beneath. Chapter. Again, chemist's ledger and a missing cork. Monday brought Inspector Slack back to St. Mary Mead with renewed determination and a warrant to search the Peretta premises more thoroughly. Miss Marple, who happened to be passing the bakery at the critical moment, was invited to accompany him. The inspector had developed a grudging respect for her powers of observation, even if he would never admit as much in public. Edwin Peretta looked diminished somehow, as though the events of the past days had physically reduced him. He admitted them without protest and stood aside while Slack and his constable began their systematic examination of the shop. "Mr. Peretta," Miss Marple said gently, "this must be very difficult for you." Edwin's hands twisted together, leaving small smudges of flour on his apron, despite the bakehouse having been cold since Friday. "I keep thinking I should have seen something. Should have known. But Maud always managed the front so efficiently. I trusted her completely. Trust is not a failing, Mr. Peretta. It is the abuse of trust that constitutes the crime." Inspector Slack emerged from the scullery behind the tea room, holding a small brown bottle with evident satisfaction. Found it tucked behind the cleaning cloths, just where Miss Marple suggested we look. Empty, but it still carries the Pratt's Chemist label. He set the bottle on the counter with care, then produced from his pocket a tiny cork, stained, dark around its edges, and this was in the drainer, sticky to the touch. Mrs. Peretta claimed she knows nothing about either. Item: Miss Marple examined the cork without touching it. The staining is consistent with the tincture, I believe. May I see Mr. Pratt's ledger entry again? Slack produced his notebook and flipped to the relevant page where he had copied the chemist's record. Mrs. Maud Peretta, 1 bottle household tincture, 1 packet linen bluing. Paid cash, 8 shillings and 6pence total. And the bottle Mr. Pratt sold would have been sealed with precisely such a cork. Once opened, the cork would naturally carry traces of the contents. Someone disposed of the empty bottle, but overlooked the cork, perhaps assuming it had been washed clean in the drainer. Careless, Slack observed with satisfaction, or rushed. Murder is a hasty business, however carefully it may be planned. There is always some small detail that escapes attention in the moment. The constable called from near the tea-room entrance. "Inspector, you'll want to see this." They found him examining Maud Peretta's apron, which had been hanging on a peg behind the curtain. In the morning light streaming through the tea-room window, a faint smear showed along the hem, brownish, and dull against the white fabric. "Matches the ring. Mark on the wrapping bench," the constable noted. Miss Marple leaned closer, though she did not touch the garment. If one were to brush against the bench while the bottle sat there, the hem would naturally pick up a trace, especially if one were moving quickly, perhaps distracted by the need to appear normal while conducting most abnormal business. Edwin made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. "I don't understand. Why would Maud do this? We had a good business, steady customers. What more did she want?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said quietly, "she wanted something other than steadiness. Some people find security stifling. Mr. Peretta, they dream of grander things and grow to resent the very stability others would prize." Inspector Slack had moved to examine the glaze brush that still lay beside the mixing bowl. He sniffed it cautiously. "This hasn't been used recently. The egg wash on it is quite dry, probably from Thursday. Yet several cakes showed that peculiar gleam on Friday morning," Miss Marple observed, "which means they were glazed with something other than egg wash, and by some means other than this brush." "What would she have used?" Edwin asked, bewildered. "Something small, a pastry brush kept separately, or even a clean cloth, something she could dispose of afterward without raising suspicion." The constable had continued his search and now produced a wadded cloth from the bottom of the kitchen waste bin. When unfolded, it showed faint brown stains and smelled distinctly of the tincture, wrapped in newspaper from 3 days ago, the constable reported, hidden under potato peelings and tea leaves. Slack nodded with grim approval. She tried to hide it, but not well enough. The cloth carries both the tincture and what appears to be butter or pastry grease. "This is what she used to apply the poison to the cakes." Miss Marple studied the cloth thoughtfully. "It would have required a light touch. Too much, and the taste would be affected, possibly alerting the victim before sufficient harm was, done." Mrs. Peretta had to paint just enough on the surface to ensure the desired result while maintaining the appearance of an ordinary glazed cake. "Monstrous," Edwin whispered. "To plan such a thing with such precision." "Calculation is often the murderer's downfall," Miss Marple said. "They believe their cleverness will protect them, that attention to small details will render them invisible. But it is precisely those details that form the pattern by which we recognize their work." Inspector Slack began gathering the evidence: the empty bottle, the stained cork, the marked apron, the wadded cloth. Each item was labeled and documented with bureaucratic thoroughness. "This should be sufficient for the magistrate," he said. Combined with the tincture traces Dr. Haydock found and the testimony about her movements that morning, we have a solid case. What of motive? Have you established the connection to the proposed sale? We're still working on that. Crowther admits there were preliminary discussions about purchasing Paretas, but he claims they never progressed beyond casual conversation. Says Edwin would have to agree to any sale, and he knew Edwin never would. Which is precisely why Mrs. Paretta needed to act without her husband's knowledge or consent. But Counselor Vane threatened to expose the scheme before it could be completed. Edwin looked up sharply. Vane knew? Knew what Maud was planning? We believe so, Slack said. He'd been making inquiries with the parish committee about business transfers. Someone must have informed him of the negotiations. Perhaps someone who disapproved of such secret dealings, but who would have told him? Miss Marple considered this. Perhaps no one told him directly. Counselor Vane was a man who paid attention to village affairs. He may simply have noticed things. A delivery van from Crowther's bakery stopping at unusual hours. Your wife posting letters to Market Basing, small indications that something was being arranged quietly. And she killed him for that, for threatening to tell me the truth about my own business. I believe she killed him because he threatened to expose her before the parish authorities as well. A charge of conducting business deceptively would have ruined not only the sale, but her reputation. Mrs. Paretta could not tolerate that threat to her ambitions. Edwin turned away, his shoulders bowed. 23 years we've been married. I thought I knew her. Thought we wanted the same things. Miss Marple touched his arm gently. We rarely know people as completely as we imagine, Mr. Paretta. We see what they choose to show us and assume the rest matches. It is only when darkness emerges that we realize how much remained hidden all along. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. Uncomfortable. With the emotional turn the conversation had taken, right, then I'll need to take these items as evidence. Mr. Paretta, you'll likely be called to testify at the inquest, I understand. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused at the doorway. Inspector, have you yet determined the significance of those caraway seeds? Seeds? Oh, that business seems a trivial detail now that we've found the bottle and cloth. But I have found that murderers reveal themselves most clearly in their trivial details. Mrs. Paretta put those seeds on the poisoned cakes for a reason, and I should very much like to know what it was. Chapter 8. The Friday Habit and the Wrong. Seed, Tuesday afternoon found Miss Marple taking tea with Dr. Haydock in his comfortable consulting room. The doctor had requested her presence, claiming a matter of professional curiosity regarding the Paretta case, though Miss Marple suspected he simply enjoyed discussing mysteries with someone who appreciated both evidence and intuition. The autopsy results are conclusive, Dr. Haydock said, pouring tea with steady hands. The tincture Mrs. Paretta purchased was more than sufficient to cause death. What interests me medically is how quickly it acted. Vane took perhaps 2 bites, maybe 3, before collapse. That suggests the concentration was quite high. She could not risk him merely becoming ill, Miss Marple observed. A sick man might recover and tell what he had eaten. A dead man tells nothing. Grimly practical. There's something else, though. I examined the crumbs from Vane's plate quite carefully. Found several currants, fragments of pastry, sugar crystals, as one would expect, but also a single caraway seed. Miss Marple set down her teacup with sudden attention. Only one? Just the one? Rather odd, as Edwin Paretta insists he never uses caraway in Eccles Cakes. Strictly a Banbury cake ingredient, he says, and he's most particular about not mixing the 2 recipes. Then how did it come to be in Counselor Vane's cake? Dr. Haydock leaned back in his chair, studying her with interest. That's what I hoped you might illuminate. You mentioned something about wrong seeds when we found Vane's body. I thought at the time you were simply making observations, but now I wonder if you'd already deduced something. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out over the high street where afternoon shoppers moved about their ordinary business. I had noticed the peculiar gleam on some of the cakes. When I examined them more closely later, I realized the shine was not egg wash, but something applied after baking. Someone had painted a coating on selected cakes, the tincture. Precisely, but such a coating, even thinly applied, would look suspicious, too glossy, too artificial. I believe Mrs. Peretta attempted to disguise the appearance by adding texture to the surface. With caraway seeds, it would serve two purposes. The seeds would break up the uniform shine, making it appear more natural, and they would suggest the cakes had been specially prepared, perhaps garnished as a flourish. Anyone noticing would think Edwin had tried something decorative, rather than suspecting poison. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. Clever in a twisted way. But why caraway specifically? Because she had it to hand, I imagine. Caraway seeds were already in the bakehouse for Banbury cakes. Mrs. Peretta simply sprinkled a few on the wet surface of the poisoned cakes, while the tincture was still tacky. They would adhere quite well. But surely Edwin would have noticed that his Eccles cakes had been garnished with the wrong seeds. Not if the garnished cakes were quickly moved to the window display and sold before he examined them closely. Edwin was in the bakehouse all morning, managing ovens and cooling racks. He trusted Maud to handle the front display. She could have arranged the window pyramid to feature the treated cakes prominently, ensuring they were sold first. Dr. Haydock poured more tea, his expression thoughtful. Vane had a Friday habit, I understand. Always bought Eccles cakes, always at roughly the same time. Exactly. So Mrs. Peretta could predict his arrival and his purchase with considerable accuracy. When he entered the shop that morning, she had only to guide him toward the poisoned cakes, perhaps suggesting they were particularly fresh or well-made. And Vane, being a man of habit, would have accepted her recommendation without question. Habits make us predictable. Doctor, and predictability is very useful to someone planning murder. Miss Marple returned to her seat and took up her teacup once more. There is another aspect to consider. Counselor Vane always purchased 2 cakes. According to Edwin, one to eat immediately in the tea room and one to take away for later. Mrs. Peretta had to ensure he consumed the poison cake first, while still in the shop. Why? If he'd taken it home and died there, surely that would have been safer for her? But less certain. At home, the cake might have been shared with his housekeeper, or set aside for another day. Mrs. Peretta needed Vane to eat the fatal cake immediately, where she could observe the result and respond appropriately. Hence her insistence that he take his tea in the alcove, comfortable and private, where he could die without causing too much disturbance, and where his death could be attributed to heat, indigestion, or any number of natural causes. Had he collapsed in the street or at home, there would have been more questions, more scrutiny. But dying quietly in a tea room after eating rich pastry on a hot day, that seemed entirely plausible. Dr. Haydock shook his head. The woman thought of everything. Not quite everything, or we should not have discovered her. She overlooked the caraway seed, betraying the wrong recipe. She failed to properly dispose of the cork and the cloth, and she underestimated how much her own helpfulness would draw attention once someone began looking. Carefully. You mean yourself? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I mean anyone who has observed how bakeries operate, Doctor. Edwin Peretta's methods were consistent and precise. When I saw cakes that had been pricked 3 times, instead of 2, when I noticed shine where there should have been none when I smelled something that did not belong in a bakehouse, these variations formed a pattern. And patterns, once recognized, lead inevitably to their source. Inspector Slack tells me Mrs. Peretta still maintains her innocence. She can hardly do otherwise. To confess would be to acknowledge not only murder, but the betrayal of her husband and the calculated abuse of her position. Some people can never admit to such darkness within themselves. Dr. Haydock walked with Miss Marple to the door of his surgery. You know, when I first heard about Vane's death, I very nearly signed it off as heart failure. The symptoms were somewhat consistent, and the circumstances seemed to support it. If you hadn't questioned the glossy cakes and pursued the matter, Maud Peretta might well have succeeded. Perhaps, though I think the caraway seed would eventually have troubled you, Doctor. You're too good a physician to ignore an anomaly, even a small one. The seed did not belong, and that wrongness would have nagged at you until you sought an explanation. You give me too much credit. I think not. We both notice when things are not as they should be. The difference is that you notice medical anomalies, while I notice domestic ones. In this case, a domestic anomaly proved fatal to poor Counselor Vane. As Miss Marple walked home through the late afternoon sunshine, she reflected on the peculiar nature of murder in small communities. In London or some great city, such a crime might have gone undetected, lost among thousands of daily transactions and anonymous deaths. But in St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew everyone, and habits were as predictable as the church, clock deviation from pattern showed as clearly as a dark thread in white linen. Mrs. Peretta had tried to be clever with her caraway seeds and her helpful manner, but cleverness was no protection against patient observation and the simple recognition that Eccles Cakes should never, ever be garnished with seeds meant for Banbury. Chapter 9. A Dozen That Was 11. Wednesday morning brought Barl Tansey to Miss Marple's cottage in a state of considerable distress. The young woman's eyes were swollen from weeping, and her hands twisted a handkerchief into damp knots as she stood on the doorstep. Miss Marple, I must speak with you. I cannot bear it any longer. The things I know, the things I've done without understanding what they meant. Miss Marple drew her inside with gentle efficiency and settled her in the sitting room with tea and reassurance. There, now, my dear, take your time and tell me what troubles you. Barl sipped her tea with trembling hands. It's about the raffle hamper, the one we were preparing for the parish fund. Mrs. Peretta had me count out a dozen Eccles cakes to set aside for it. This was early Friday morning, perhaps 7. I counted them most carefully, 12 exactly, and placed them in the special box we keep for such orders. And then, Mrs. Peretta sent me to the post office with some correspondence. When I returned, perhaps 20 minutes later, she was rearranging the window display. She told me to check the hamper count again, as she thought one might have been damaged and needed replacing. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Had one been damaged? That's just it. When I counted again, there were only 11 cakes in the box. I said as much to Mrs. Peretta, and she seemed quite unconcerned. She said she'd already replaced the missing one from the window stock, and I was to wrap the hamper without further fuss. But you did not see her add a replacement? Barl shook her head miserably. No, though I assumed she had done so while I was out. I wrapped the hamper and thought nothing more of it, until Counselor Vane died. Now I cannot stop thinking about those cakes, about the count being wrong. Did you notice anything unusual about the cakes in the window when Mrs. Peretta was rearranging them? Only that some looked shinier than others, as though they had been freshly glazed. I mentioned it to Mrs. Peretta, said perhaps they needed a light dusting of sugar to match the rest. She became quite sharp with me, said they were perfectly fine, and I should attend to my own work. Miss Marple rose and fetched her notebook from the writing desk. Barl, I want you to think very carefully. When did Mrs. Peretta send you to Pratt's shop? That was earlier, around 7:45. She said we were running low on baking powder and I should fetch some straight away. But you had sufficient baking powder already? Barl's face flushed. Yes. When I returned and put the new packet in the cupboard, I saw we already had 2 unopened ones. I thought it odd, but said nothing. Mrs. Peretta did not like to be questioned about household management. And these errands, to the post office and to Pratt's, they kept you away from the shop front for how long each time? The trip to Pratt's was perhaps 15 minutes. The post office visits were shorter, 10 minutes or so each time. Mrs. Peretta was most particular about me going. Immediately when she asked, Miss Marple made notes in her precise hand. Tell me about the wrapping scales. Do you recall using them Friday morning? Oh yes, constantly. We weigh all the special orders to ensure fair portions. The raffle hamper, several birthday orders, the usual trade. Barl paused, her brow furrowing. Though there was something peculiar. When I went to weigh out some seed cake for a customer around 9, I noticed a greasy mark on the scale plate, curved like a crescent. I'd cleaned it thoroughly at opening, so the mark must have appeared during the morning. A crescent shape, you say? Yes, as though something round had been set on the scale while it was wet or oily. I wiped it away and thought no more of it. Miss Marple sat back, her expression thoughtful. The rim of a cake that had been treated with the tincture would leave precisely such a mark. Mrs. Peretta may have weighed one of the poisoned cakes separately, perhaps to ensure it matched the weight of the others in appearance. Barl's hands flew to her mouth. Then she was checking that her terrible work would not be detected. Quite possibly. Mrs. Peretta was nothing if not thorough in her preparations. Miss Marple consulted her notes once more. You mentioned that Mrs. Peretta asked you to make the cakes pretty. What exactly did she mean by that? Fresh tears welled in Barl's eyes. That's the worst of it, Miss Marple. She gave me a fork from my own drawer, one with slightly bent middle tines, and told me to make decorative marks on some of the cake tops. She said they looked too plain and needed additional texture. I thought she meant to improve the display, so I pricked several cakes with 3 holes instead of the usual 2. I never imagined I was helping to disguise murder. My dear child, you were not helping. You were being used, manipulated by someone who understood your eagerness to please and your trust in authority. But I did it. I pricked those cakes that may have carried poison. Did you apply the tincture to the cakes? No, of course not. Did you know the cakes were being poisoned? No. But I should have questioned why Mrs. Peretta wanted me to alter Mr. Peretta's traditional method. He's so particular about his 2-prick pattern. Miss Marple reached across and took Barl's trembling hand. You are a young woman employed by someone you trusted to know better than yourself. When your employer gives you instructions, you follow them. That is not complicity, Barl. That is simply being a conscientious employee. Inspector, Slack will think I was involved. Inspector, Slack will think no such thing once he understands the full picture. Mrs. Peretta deliberately sent you away at crucial moments and used your innocent labor to disguise her guilty work. You were a tool, not an accomplice. Barl dabbed at her eyes with the wrung handkerchief. What should I do? You should tell Inspector Slack exactly what you have told me. The business about the dozen that became 11 is particularly important. It establishes that Mrs. Peretta removed one of the poisoned cakes from the hamper and replaced it from the window stock, probably after Counselor Vane's purchase. She could not risk one of the deadly cakes ending up in a raffle prize that might be shared among innocent parish members, so she was selective about who would die. Precisely. She wanted only Counselor Vane dead, not some random family enjoying their raffle winnings. That degree of calculation makes the crime even more deliberate, even more damning. Miss Marple walked Barl to the door with encouraging words, and the promise that truth, however uncomfortable, was always preferable to silent guilt. After the young woman departed, Miss Marple returned to her sitting room and studied the note she'd made. The pattern was now complete in all its awful detail. Mrs. Peretta had treated several cakes with tincture, probably 3 or 4 at most. She had disguised their appearance with caraway seeds and additional fork pricks. She had arranged the window display to ensure the treated cakes were prominently placed. She had sent Barl on invented errands to work unobserved. She had removed a poison cake from the raffle, hamper to protect innocent buyers, and she had guided Counselor Vane to consume his fatal purchase. While seated in the tea-room alcove, where his death would appear most natural, every action calculated, every detail managed, every piece of evidence that might have been properly disposed of was instead carelessly overlooked in the confidence that a village bakery death would never merit serious investigation. But Mrs. Peretta had failed to account for one thing, the possibility that someone might actually look closely at her perfectly arranged display and notice that perfection itself was suspicious. Missy Marple gathered her knitting and allowed herself a small, grim smile. Murderers so rarely understood that it was not the grand gestures that betrayed them, but the small adjustments they made while trying to appear ordinary. Chapter 10. Bakehouse. Thursday. Morning found a small gathering assembled in the bakehouse at Peretta's, where the cooling rack stood empty and the ovens had grown cold. The summer heat had returned after the brief respite of rain, and flour dust hung suspended in shafts of sunlight that fell through the high windows. Inspector Slack had arranged this final meeting with the precision of a man laying out evidence for a magistrate. Present were Edwin Peretta, pale and drawn but standing upright with quiet dignity, Barl Tansey, nervous but resolute, Dr. Haydock, observing, with professional detachment, Mrs. Bantry, who had accompanied Miss Marple, and Maud Peretta, herself brought from the police cells, where she had spent the past 3 days maintaining her innocence with icy determination. Maud stood beside the wrapping bench, her hands folded before her, her expression composed. Only the slight tension in her jaw betrayed any awareness of her circumstances. Miss Marple stood near the cooling racks, her knitting bag over her arm, though she made no move to take out her work. This was not a time for such gentle occupations. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. We are gathered here so that certain facts may be established beyond question before this matter proceeds to the assizes. Miss Marple has assisted in piecing together the sequence of events, and I believe it would benefit all parties to hear the full account. He gestured to Miss Marple, who inclined her head and began to speak in her clear, gentle voice. The method was both simple and effective. On Friday morning, after Edwin had baked and cooled his usual batch of Eccles Cakes, someone took 3 or 4 of them from the cooling rack and painted their tops with a household tincture purchased the previous day from Mr. Pratt's establishment. This tincture, being oily in nature, gave the treated cakes a distinctive shine, quite unlike the appearance of proper egg wash. Edwin made a small sound of pain, but said nothing to disguise this suspicious gleam. The person scattered a few caraway seeds on the wet surface of each treated cake. These seeds, normally reserved for Banbury cakes, had no place on Eccles pastry, but they served to break up the uniform shine and suggest deliberate garnish rather than something sinister. Miss Marple moved to stand beside the wrapping bench, her fingers hovering above the surface without quite touching it. The person then took a fork with bent middle tines and made an additional prick in each treated cake, creating 3 holes instead of Edwin's customary 2. This was meant to add texture and further disguise the abnormal appearance. The fork came from Barl's drawer, and Barl herself was instructed to perform this task without being told its true purpose. Barl looked down at her hands, her face flushed with remembered shame. How did the poison reach Counselor Vane? Inspector Slack prompted, through careful arrangement and exploitation of known habits. Counselor Vane came to Paretta's every Friday morning at approximately the same time. He always purchased 2 Eccles Cakes, one to eat immediately in the tea room and one to take away. This predictability made him an ideal target for someone planning murder. Miss Marple turned to face Maud Paretta directly, though her voice remained gentle. The poison cakes were placed prominently in the window display, arranged in the top row of the pyramid where they would be most visible and most likely to be selected first. When Counselor Vane entered the shop, he was guided to sit in the tea room alcove, away from other customers. The person serving him selected one of the treated cakes for his immediate consumption and a safe one for his bag. "That's speculation," Maud said, her voice tight. "You cannot prove any of this." On the contrary, Mrs. Paretta, the evidence is quite substantial. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. "We have the empty bottle of tincture found hidden behind cleaning cloths in your scullery. We have the cork from that bottle recovered from your drainer and carrying traces of the poison. We have the cloth you used to apply the tincture, found in your kitchen waste bin. We have your apron bearing stains that match both the bottle ring on this wrapping bench and the chemical composition of the tincture itself." Maud's composure wavered slightly. "Those things prove nothing. Anyone could have placed them in my scullery." "Mr. Pratt's ledger shows you purchased the tincture," Slack continued. "Agnes Reed witnessed the delivery. The errand boy who brought it recalls you tipping him for his discretion. And Barl can testify that you sent her away on false errands at precisely the times when you needed to work unobserved." "Why?" Edwin's voice broke the measured recitation, raw with anguish. "Why did you do it, Maud? What did Harold Vane ever do to you?" Maud's face hardened. "He threatened everything I had worked for, planned for, sacrificed for. He discovered I was negotiating to sell this place to Crowther, and he was going to expose me to the parish committee, to you, to everyone. He would have ruined it all. You were selling my bakery without my knowledge?" Edwin's voice was barely a whisper. "Your bakery? Always your bakery? Never our bakery? Never our future? Only your precious ovens and your perfect 2-prick pattern and your satisfied customers content to pay pennies for bread." Maud's careful composure cracked, revealing the bitterness beneath. 23 years. I've stood behind that counter, smiling at villagers, serving tea to farmers' wives, counting copper coins. Did you ever once ask me what I wanted? Whether I might dream of something more than flour dust and cooling racks? So you decided to sell what was not yours to sell, Miss Marple said quietly. And when Counselor Vane threatened to prevent that sale, you killed him. I made him quiet. I made the threat disappear. Maud's voice had taken on a peculiar flatness. It was simple enough, a little tincture on a few cakes, a few seeds to make them pretty, and the problem was solved. No one would ever have known if that busybody hadn't started examining cake tops like some sort of demented detective. Mrs. Bantry drew in a sharp breath. Inspector Slack's hand moved to his pocket, perhaps seeking handcuffs, but Miss Marple raised one hand slightly, asking for patience. "Mrs. Paretta, you speak of making cakes pretty, but pretty things can be very dangerous when painted with poison. You removed one of the treated cakes from the raffle hamper because you knew it might harm innocent people. That shows you understood exactly what you had created. I only wanted what was mine by right, what I had earned through years of service." "What you wanted?" Miss Marple said, her voice carrying unexpected steel, "was to profit from your husband's reputation while betraying his trust. You wanted money gained through deception, and when someone threatened to reveal your schemes, you chose murder rather than honesty." Edwin moved to the bench where his cooling rack stood empty. He touched one rack with trembling fingers, as though seeking comfort from familiar objects. "Baking depends upon honest measures," he said softly. Flour, butter, sugar, measured true. Pricks for steam, no more, no less. When such honesty alters, everything spoils. Maud laughed, a harsh sound. Your honest measures kept us trapped in this village, in this shop, forever. They kept us honorable. Inspector Slack stepped forward. Mrs. Maud Peretta, you will be formally charged with the willful murder of Counselor Harold Vane through the administration of poison. Do you have anything to say? Maud drew herself up, her face settling back into its mask of control. I only made them pretty. Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. Pretty things can be very dangerous when one paints them with the wrong bottle. My dear, as Inspector Slack led Maud Peretta away, Edwin remained standing by his cooling racks, one hand still resting on the wire mesh. Barl moved to his side, not speaking, simply standing in companionship with shared grief. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. She'll hang, most likely. Premeditated poisoning with multiple pieces of evidence. The jury won't be sympathetic. No, Miss Marple agreed. They will not. Mrs. Bantry squeezed her friend's arm. You've solved another one, Jane, though I rather wish you hadn't needed to. So do I. Dolly, so do I. They left the bakehouse together, stepping from the flower-dusty dimness into the bright June morning. Behind them, Edwin Peretta stood alone among his empty racks and cold ovens, contemplating the ruins of 23 years built on what he had believed was shared. Honest work. Miss Marple paused at the door and looked back. Mr. Peretta, the village still needs its baker. When you're ready, your customers will return. Good bread and honest measures will always find favor. Edwin nodded without speaking. As they walked down the high street, Miss Marple folded her hands around her knitting bag and spoke quietly to Mrs. Bantry. Baking is rather like life itself, you know. It requires honest ingredients, careful attention, and respect for proper methods. When someone tries to take shortcuts or substitute false for true, the result is always disaster. Mrs. Peretta thought she could glaze over her deceptions and make them appear wholesome. But poison painted on pastry remains poison, however prettily one arranges the seeds. Will Edwin recover, do you think? In time. He has his craft and his integrity. That is more than many people possess. Miss Marple glanced back at the bakery with its brass rail gleaming in the sun. And perhaps in time, he will find someone to share his honest measures. Someone who values what he values and seeks no more than what can be honorably gained. They walked on through the village, past the post office where Agnes Reed watched from her window, past the church where the vicar was tending the cemetery roses, past all the ordinary places where ordinary people conducted their ordinary lives, most of them never knowing how close. Murder had come to their Friday morning treats, and Miss Marple thought, as she so often did, how wickedness wore such commonplace disguises, and how the difference between good and evil could sometimes be measured in something as small as an extra prick in a cake top, or a wrong seed, scattered on a glossy surface. Small dishonesties led to larger ones, and the largest dishonesty of all was believing one could murder without consequence, simply because one had been very, very careful about the details. But careful or not, murder always left its traces, always showed its pattern, always revealed itself to those patient enough to look, and wise enough to recognize that when small, honest things changed. Wickedness was generally the cause.